Welcome to Chapter 8 video, where we're going to look at patterns of consumption for energy. And we're going to look at this in terms of basically the history of energy consumption. So kind of throughout human history, how energy has been used and how it's been consumed and kind of the trend of how much energy has been used, say over the last several hundred years. We'll then talk about electrical energy. We'll mention some economics and um, politics that affect energy use around the globe. And then we'll look at some energy consumption trends. So basically look at how much energy is being used and what that type of energy use looks like in the future. So if you remember from the last chapter, we mentioned the food webs. Right? We mentioned energy sources. I believe it was the last chapter. And what we stated is that energy enters a system. It enters an ecosystem and the environment through the process of photosystem. So this is the initial energy transfer, right, in a system. And so it's basically the sun, right, and that provides solar radiation. And then you have, leaves, flowers, right, that take up that solar radiation. They photosynthesize and they convert this. Man, my mouse is really, not my mouse, but my drawing pad is kind of funky today. Is inorganic to organic chemical energy, right? And so that energy is transferred into the ecosystem. So these photons through photosynthesis. And so early on in human history, we kind of figured out, we as in humans, kind of figured out other energy sources that are able to make life much more comfortable and kind of affect the quality of life. And so early on, right, in human history, we discover, fire and determine that burning wood allows us to provide a heat energy to where we can all of a sudden prepare food differently. We can warm up our living areas, and then over time figured out how to use that heat energy to develop metallurgy and to blacksmith, to make all kinds of different tools. And so that really kind of changed the way people lived. So you have dense, rapidly growing settlements, populations increasing in those areas, and they harvest this wood relatively quickly because now all of a sudden you're not just using wood to build structures, but you're also using wood as a fuel source, as an energy source. And so once they kind of overuse or overexploit the wood in the surrounding area, they then have to look for and utilize new fuel sources, and one of those primary fuel sources was coal. And so with the development of these complex early civilizations, you need more and more demand for energy. And so like we mentioned, we use heavy use of wood for building materials and then also heating, cooking, etc. But as that wood's used up, you need other alternative sources for that fuel use. And like we mentioned, that alternative fuel, we found to be coal. So during the Carboniferous period, so we're talking about, hundreds of millions of years ago, so anywhere from 280 to about 350 million years ago, the conditions on the Earth were pretty different compared to today. And the environmental conditions were really conducive um, to the formation of coal deposits. And so basically, coal is formed out of biological material. So it could be like plant matter, it could be animal matter, and it kind of gets under high pressure and it can be formed into coal, or it could be formed into oil deposits or natural gas deposits. And a lot of the fossil fuels come from these one-celled marine organisms, so single-celled marine organisms. And now eventually humans discover this coal and they figure out that you can burn the coal and it has a high energy capacity. And so during the Industrial Revolution, we develop machines, and those machines can use energy to do jobs much quicker than humans were completing those jobs. And they're also cheaper than what you would have to pay a human to do that job. So even if it wasn't quicker, if you had a machine that was doing the job of a human, you only had to pay for the machine. And eventually you would begin to profit once you pay for that machine, right? But a human, you always have to pay them. And so you really kind of never get that back. And so you have things like steam engines taking the heat energy and using that heat to develop steam to run some sort of machine or engine. And so it's transferred into forward motion, right? So that kinetic energy. And so these steam engines really kind of drove the industrial revolutions. And if you didn't have coal deposits or some sort of fossil fuel to use, coal or oil, um, you were left behind because you weren't able to run these machines. So it was the countries that actually had access to these deposits that were able to, kind of keep up with how things were changing, and those became your developed countries. And so before the Industrial Revolution, like we mentioned, a lot of that manufacturing process came from humans, from human labor. And it was really on this small scale where they would kind of work out of their homes or work out of a shop in the backyard or, on their land. And what eventually happened is with the Industrial Revolution, with the expansion to machines and steam engines, etc., you get expanding factories that need larger labor pools. So even though the machines were being built, kind of replacing human labor, you still need mechanics to work those machines. You still need other types of labor depending on the job. And so the increase of factories and workshops in these cities meant that people began congregating and kind of flocking to the cities because of the increase in job availability. But what also happens is whenever you use more coal in these cities, you get increased levels of air pollution. And within about 200 years, the daily per capita energy consumption in industrialized nations increased by a magnitude of 8, which is a considerable amount of energy increase. Right? So we're talking about 8 times the energy use within a span of 200 years. And what also happens is as factories are developed, as machines are developed, and technology increases, and you get kind of better working machines, and people learn how machines work, and you invent new technology, you end up with things that are really revolutionary, like the automobile. The automobile really kind of changed the demand for oil-based products. So now, because you have this engine, you need oil for lubrication, and then you also need gas, which is derived from those oil products to fuel the movement of the parts in the engine, right? And with the invention of automobiles and the kind of growth of the automobile industry, cars becoming cheaper and everybody being able to afford a car, led to really extensive roadway constructions. And it costs energy to construct these highways and these roads. I don't know if you ever kind of sit back and think, but I imagine all the time what the world looked like before, all of these major highways and bypasses and freeways kind of connected everything. I think it would be, just a really interesting concept. And in fact, one of my favorite kind of parts of history is the Lewis and Clark expedition, where they're trying to connect the East with the West. And they're kind of the first non-Native American explorers to really, go across the continent. And they don't have roads, they have to use rivers. So they're trying to find this kind of single waterway that would connect that continent. Now, that single waterway didn't exist. They had to do a portage, that sort of thing. But much, much different in terms of transportation then compared to today. Now you can just get in a car and you can drive completely across the country unimpeded. And in fact, we recently did that. We drove from California to North Carolina, and we did so in 4 days. Well, 4.5 days in terms of driving time. Um, Back then it would have taken you months to do that. And it would have been very difficult. You would have had to, cross rivers without bridges and all of that stuff. And so the roadway construction, automobile industry really revolutionized how people live, how we use energy, and the demand for energy across the world. And as the automobile industry kind of got better, you get better roads. So now your cars can be built to go higher in terms of speeds, and higher speeds, lead to faster cars. Bigger, faster cars require more efficient roads. And so you kind of have this evolution of roads to the car, or car to the roads. Um, and also, those bigger, faster cars require bigger engines, and they require more energy. You look at the amount of gas that a truck uses versus a car. Just to give you an example, I have a 4x4 Chevy Silverado. It's a 1500 base, the lower model. So it's not like a dually or a diesel or anything, but it has a V8 engine. And I pulled our camping trailer across the country, and my truck usually gets about 25 miles to the gallon on the highway. But with pulling the camper, I only got 9 miles to the gallon. Um, and so being able to have that big truck that uses all of this energy means that I have to use more gas, right? So I was stopping much more frequently and buying gas compared to the car that my wife was driving. She was following me in our other car. We have a hybrid, and that car gets 72 miles to the gallon on the highway. And so I would be spending like 50 or $60 to put gas in the truck, whereas she's spending $8 every time we filled up. Because she wasn't using all of her gas tank where I was. And so the evolution of these cars and these vehicles leads to more and more energy use. And that's something we kind of don't think about on a daily basis. And this kind of goes back to the idea of ecological footprints and evaluating that. Because, I have a truck because of the utility of it, but it makes my ecological footprint much higher, and that's something I need to be aware of. And so, yeah, so automobiles lead to very different terms of energy use in the world as they begin to develop. And what's also interesting is when you get automobiles, you now have job growth, right, in automobile related industries, because now everybody's getting automobiles, and so more and more need to be made. The demand's higher, but it also has a big role in the development of industrialized nations, especially in terms of being able to commute, right? Because before automobiles, people had to live in, or basically in the cities in order to work in the city. But now, because you have an automobile, all of a sudden you can live 30 minutes away, an hour away, and still commute to work and be able to profit, even though you're using energy and gas in order to commute to work. And so what we see, is this kind of change in energy demand over time, where you have lots of cars, you have differences in lifestyles, bigger houses, much more energy being used in those houses, and much more, much larger and sophisticated roadways, bypasses, freeways, kind of connecting the globe, right? You have this connectivity that happens with automobiles, and then we could also say planes really kind of revolutionize that as well, because planes are very energy demanding. And like I mentioned, the automobiles really change people's lifestyles. You're able to travel greater distances. Like I mentioned, we went across the country in 4.5 to 5 days, where, if you did that 200 years ago, it was taking you months to get across the country. You also can live farther from work. Like I mentioned, that commute time. And so what that does is it means that you have larger cities, and then you have suburbs that are outside of those cities. And so in the suburbs, you have these really kind of labor saving, energy consuming devices that you have that in your home. So for example, our technology, our automatic thermostats, our, Alexas, our Google Homes, etc., while they make our lives easier, more kind of quality of life, they do consume energy. And what's interesting is when you go to a grocery store, you expect to see oranges, you expect to see lettuce that come from different states. So for example, if you're in, Idaho, you can get oranges that came from Florida. You can get lettuces and salad greens that came from the Salinas Valley. You can get bananas and avocados that come from Mexico or Central America, pretty much any supermarket. And for example, in California, you got Idaho potatoes. And so what this means is that a lot of energy has to be used in order to gather, process that food, refrigerate it, and transport it to these distant locations. And so that's why whenever we were talking about kind of the ecological footprint and the effect that you have on your life based off of your lifestyle, and we talked about buying local, right? So if you buy local goods, then they're not going through these processes, right? And so they're using less energy. And so that's one of the reasons you hear kind of an increase in terms of, people pledging to buy local. Not only does it have an impact on kind of energy use, but it also helps local businesses because now with, Amazon and the globalization of the world, people are buying on the internet and buying products that have come long distances and use that energy rather than kind of supporting their local communities. And again, that's something we need to kind of look at in terms of ecological footprint and how we're kind of growing in our local areas in terms of economic growth, etc. Um, so the next thing we're going to look at is kind of the growth of natural gas. So initially, natural gas was burned as a waste product at oil wells. So whenever you dig oil, whenever you drill for oil, you'll hit an oil well and then you can pump that oil out, but then there's natural gas that's in that kind of cavity that the oil's sitting in. And so they typically burn that natural gas as it comes out. And that was kind of the main kind of fate of the natural gas initially. So before 1940, only used for about 10% of energy consumption needs. But within 30 years, that increased by about 20%. And then currently it's over 30% in terms of US consumption. And we typically use natural gas for things like heating, cooking, so like your gas stoves. You can have like gas furnaces that heat your home. You can have like a gas fireplace. Um, and a lot of industries use natural gas for their energy needs. And whenever we kind of look at energy use and maintaining a specific lifestyle, the amount of energy used per country for the residents to kind of maintain their lifestyle um, can vary from country to country and culture to culture. So, for example, United States, the U.S. uses about 2 times as much energy as some European countries and Japan, and about 3 times more energy as the populations in China, and about 13 times. This is a huge number, 13 times more than people in India. So the United States is consuming a ton of energy. And that's not saying that other countries aren't consuming a lot of energy, but relatively speaking, when we compare it across the board with other countries, we use a lot of energy. And industrialized nations in general use a lot of energy. And so notice that, you have France, Japan, Germany, and China here, and we're using more, but they're using quite a bit of energy as well. Again, it's just we're using more. And so those industrialized nations will use energy for transportation, like we just talked about, industrial uses, so factory, etc., but then also residential and commercial uses, so home heating, that sort of thing. Your lesser developed countries typically use energy for residential purposes. Transportation is not, is generally kind of low in a lot of the poorer, less developed countries. Um, You'll see people like on bicycles or walking a lot. They have cars in those less developed countries, but again, it's not as usually not as big. And so most of the energy is coming from, cooking and heating processes. Um, Developing countries, however, are using much of their energy to develop that industry sector and to keep development going, to maintain the economy, etc. So for example, in North America, 16% of our energy use is used for residential, 12% for commercial. Canada, however, uses 60% for residential. Or actually 60% of residential energy is used for heating, right? So that's a little bit different. Um, so North America, 16% is residential, 12 commercial. And then when you kind of look at the subcategory of residential energy, Canada uses 60% of residential energy for heating. Um, in Africa and Asia, again, lesser developed in some areas, so cooking, which comes from wood. And when we look at the more developed countries, so countries that have access to like your computer systems and the internet, um, the estimates are that the internet consumes about 10% of the energy supply in the US. So this was early estimates, but more recently is estimated to be about 3% of the electrical energy supply. So, I mean, that's quite a bit of energy to run the internet. Now, if you look at industrial processes from country to country in terms of the amount of energy used, it's going to vary considerably again due to what that population requires in terms of industry, kind of what they're focusing on, how developed they are, etc. And so countries that are developing new industries will have a high percentage of energy use dedicated to that development. So, for example, South Korea and China devote 50% to industrial purposes, but your already industrialized countries have a significant amount of energy and industry, but they can afford to use energy in other sectors because they've already got that industrialization developed. They've kind of already got that process set up. In terms of per capita energy use for transportation, again, developing countries is going to be high, and your highest is already in the developed countries because they have those roads set up, they have those transportation pathways available, they have access to automobiles. And so when you also combine that with public transportation, so like buses, railways, waterways, those developed countries are using a lot in terms of transportation energy. Countries with high population densities, the rail and bus, so basically your public transportation, is pretty efficient. So you generally see those in like your larger cities, much more efficient than everybody driving a single vehicle. But in the United States, that's not really the case. Typically, 3/4 of Americans will drive alone to get to work. Lower percentage for some other sort of transportation to work, like walking, working from home, public transportation, carpooling, bicycle, and other methods. And so there are many more vehicles on the US, and those vehicles are actually using much more energy compared to like European vehicles, because of the way we drive and the distances that we commute, and then the fact that we use very little public transportation. A lot of European countries have pretty good public transportation set up, and so those energy uses for automobiles are pretty different. But now looking at electrical energy, so kind of moving away from fossil fuels, electrical energy is basically where you have a large proportion of energy. Well, first, let's just say that we're focusing on electrical energy, and we're going to talk about it because there are quite a bit of countries now that are moving to using electrical energy, and using it in a large enough proportion to where we can, we start kind of focusing on it, and discussing it. Now, it should have been discussed anyways because it's, typically, it's used pretty much everywhere, and it comes from, right, the burning of fossil fuels. So you can burn fossil fuels. So it doesn't have to come from fossil fuel burning, but most of it comes from fossil fuel burning. I should say it that way. And so basically you can, burn coal to heat steam to turn a turbine, and that turbine, the movement of that turbine can be converted into electrical energy. And that electrical energy can be transported via a current through some sort of grid, and kind of transportation network, right? And it's actually relatively simple to transport this electrical energy, and you can get it to large places around the globe, right? You can have very large grid networks, and so because we use a lot of electrical energy and it's kind of a big part of our energy consumption, we kind of focus on it in its own section. That's basically what I was trying to get at. And so the link between economic growth and inexpensive energy is this direct link, right? And so they directly affect one another. So if you are an industrial society and you want a continuous supply of affordable energy, or generally they want a continuous supply of affordable energy, right? That's the main goal. You want a constant supply of energy that's affordable, that can be supplied to your population. However, if your energy price goes up, your goods go up. So that directly affects your economics, right? So if you get pricier energy, you get pricier goods, things become more expensive. So the economy is affected because of that. So what exists are things like subsidies to basically help keep energy costs down so that the goods aren't as expensive and that people can afford those goods and they can afford that energy. For example, automobile fuel is an energy source that can be directly affected, or it can directly affect the economy based on the price. If there are high gas prices, people aren't going to travel. They're not going to vacation because they just can't afford it. Lower gas prices means that people are going to be able to travel, be able to vacation, or they may even have extra money to spend on other things because they're not spending a majority of their funds on gas and transportation. Most of the differences, though, in gasoline prices are a result of taxes and then differences in government policy. And this is even between states in the US. So you can go from state to state, and gas prices are going to be different based on state taxes, based on how the energy taxes are, the laws for energy, etc. So for example, on our trip, we, gas is around, $4 and, 40 cents, or, $4.30, somewhere around there in California. But now when we got to the desert, kind of going to Arizona, we paid $5 for a gallon of gas right before we got into the Mojave. So that was California. But now as we left California, now California has some stricter, I'm not going to go into the details, but they have like stricter taxes and environmental laws, that sort of thing. So gas is a little pricier. But then we saw, it kind of dropping down into the $3. And then eventually in North Carolina, we're paying like $2.80 for gas. And so that's a big difference, even between states. And so these differences also exist between countries. And again, it's reflected in the local taxes, the policy towards that fuel, and kind of a lot of other underlying things with economics and policy, basically. We also can look at the kind of automobiles driven between countries, and you can find a relationship between cost and fuel efficiency. So, for example, the average European car driver pays more than twice as much for fuel as the US. And they use about 40% less fuel to drive the same distance as a US driver. So they pay more for fuel, but use less. So it kind of evens out in that way. Some governments will charge road users, right, to help build and repair roads by taxing fuel. And you'll see signs in the US where you'll see like construction paid for by your tax dollars or something like that. And for example, European countries, they raise more money from fuel taxes than they spend on building and repairing roads. The US only raises about 50% needed to repair roads from fuel taxes. So European countries have higher fuel prices, and they're actually paying for the roads in a lot of cases with those taxes. The US only pays for about half of the cost and has to come up with the other half of that cost from some other method. And so the low fuel costs in the US encourage more travel, but it increases road repair costs because there's so much more travel on the roads and the highways. Now, there's this coalition or network of countries referred to as OPEC. So it's the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, and it consists of 13 countries. And these 13 countries control about 71% of the world's estimated oil reserves. So roughly 1,700 billion barrels, quite a bit. From 2011 to 2014, generally the cost was about $100 per barrel. And then about the middle of 2017 it was roughly half that cost, so about $50 per barrel. Now this table here shows you countries that are some of the major oil producing countries, and then it shows you if they are part of OPEC. Right, so it's those countries there. Okay. And then it also shows you the percent of the total that their oil reserves contain. Okay. In terms of energy consumption and energy trends around the globe, in 2015, the world consumed about 30 million metric tons of oil. This is an actual increase of about 17% from about 2005. So from about 2005 to 2015, the oil use increased by about 17%. And fossil fuels are nearly 90% of that total in terms of energy consumption. Now, half of the world's energy consumption is by the 25 countries that are part of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD. Out of those energy resources, oil makes up about 33%, coal's about 30%, natural gas is about 24%, and then the rest is by nuclear energy, hydropower, and then alternative energy sources are lower than that. And so if we look at the use of energy, you see the world from 65 to 2015, substantial increase, right? Going from a little less than 4,000 metric tons to a little over 12,000, right? So about 3 times more. The United States we're using by ourselves, what's that? Probably 1,500, somewhere around there, to slightly over 2,000. So out of 11 or 13,000, the United States is using 2,000, right? So 11,000 metric tons is left by the rest of the world. So we're a pretty good percentage of that. Asia Pacific is even larger, so they're about 5,000. So just between these two, right, we're making up, what is that, 7 metric tons out of about 13, 12 and a half. So about half of that energy use is coming from the United States and the Asian Pacific countries. So pretty big energy use. Primary factors that determine energy use in a country is often political stability in those oil producing countries, and then the price of oil. So the price of oil determines whether or not people can afford it, and then political stability will affect the price of oil, whether or not those oil producing countries are in war, or if they're having issues politically, or that can lead to higher oil prices. And so how those countries are in terms of their political state can really determine the price of oil. So for example, you have during the 1980s, energy costs in North America and Europe declined, and people became less concerned about energy consumption because of the decrease in those prices. So they used more energy, bought more things, bought more cars, basically because they could afford, because of the low energy prices. Energy consumption behavior, though, is typically motivated by economics. Right? So again, if energy is cheap, you're not really going to care about conserving it. If it's expensive, you're going to be like focusing on whether or not you're using a bunch of energy or not, mainly because you don't want to pay hundreds of dollars for an electric bill, right? And so over the past several years, oil prices have been extremely volatile. They've fluctuated. Um, for OPEC and countries of the Middle East, so they control about 40% of the world's oil production, 70% of the oil reserves. So the political stability in these areas is really important because it's directly related to the oil prices, right? Again, it goes back to kind of this where political stability determines oil prices, which again is related to energy use and energy consumption. All right, so that's it for chapter 8. Here's the summary for this chapter. Again, go through it, kind of focus on these key ideas, and then go back and look at other other topics that we mentioned. So again, use this as a starting point for studying. As always, let me know if you have any questions. If you have any concerns, you can contact me via email, or you can contact me via the course discussion board. And so with that, I hope you have a good rest of your day, and we will see you in the next chapter.